listener production.
Hi, Natarsha Belling with you and welcome to the afternoon edition of The Briefing. Coming up in our deep dive, it's only October, but New South Wales has already recorded the highest number of Indigenous deaths in custody in a single year. This horrifying statistic has seen State Coroner Teresa O'Sullivan call out the, quote, profoundly distressing milestone, saying these deaths demand independent and careful scrutiny, respect and accountability. Advocates say this crisis is a national shame and after decades of neglect, urgent action is needed. But first, let's check the afternoon headlines this Wednesday, the 15th of October. Investigations are continuing after a horror house fire that killed 3 people in Central Queensland. Authorities are yet to officially identify the bodies, but it's believed they are a mother and 2 children. Eyewitnesses say they heard explosions as the large fire ripped through the 2-storey home near Gladstone early this morning. Here's Detective Acting Superintendent Luke Peachy from Queensland Police.
Numerous units, both QFRES and police, have attended the scene and are still on scene. So it'll be a number of days probably before we know the full circumstances of that fire.
The US President says the second stage of the Gaza ceasefire has started as concerns grow over the fragile peace plan in the Middle East. Hamas has handed over the remains of more Israeli hostages after being accused of withholding bodies. The Red Cross has warned it will be difficult to retrieve those killed given the amount of destruction and rubble in Gaza. It comes as reports grow that Hamas fighters are starting to reassert control in Gaza and executed several people. Donald Trump with this warning for Hamas if it doesn't disarm as promised.
And if they don't disarm, we will disarm them. And it'll happen quickly and perhaps violently.
The Gaza Health Ministry says at least 6 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces since the hostage exchange. Meantime, Israel has announced it will halve the number of humanitarian aid trucks into Gaza. UNICEF spokesperson Tess Ingham telling Sky News it's essential the aid gets through.
We would urge the Israeli authorities to not use aid in this manner, to open all of the crossings as soon as possible and allow aid to flow into the Gaza Strip unfettered. And controversial US YouTuber Candace Owens has lost her appeal in the High Court over the decision to deny her entry into Australia. Home Affairs Minister Tony Burke rejected Miss Owens' visa application last October, saying the influencer may incite discord during her national speaking tour. Miss Owens launched legal action earlier this year, claiming the visa rejection contravened implied freedom of political communication. Miss Owens has attracted controversy over remarks made about Jewish, transgender and Muslim people. Now it's time to get into our deep dive on the growing number of Indigenous deaths in custody. CEO of the Redfern Legal Centre, Camilla Pandolfini, says these latest statistics are a national shame. And after decades of neglect from both sides of government, authorities need to step up. Camilla, thanks so much for joining us on this really important conversation today. We've seen pretty interesting comments from the New South Wales State Coroner making rare comments as the state records the most ever Indigenous deaths in custody in a single year. Are you surprised by this?
I'm not surprised, but I am shocked and horrified. It's a shocking and horrifying statistic, an unacceptable number, and something that all of us should be concerned about. The community, the government, everyone should be concerned about this.
The New South Wales coroner, I'll quote her here, has described the spate of Indigenous deaths in custody as profoundly distressing as the state records the most ever in a single year. Can I ask you why this is happening?
I would say that this is happening for a number of reasons. One of those is that the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody happened 3 decades ago, and still the recommendations have not been taken up by successive governments, by federal governments, by state governments. It happens because First Nations people in New South Wales are overrepresented across every aspect of our criminal justice system, including policing. And so Redfern Legal Centre does a lot of work around police accountability. And we see over and over again that First Nations people are disproportionately targeted. And it's also happening because of laws that have been introduced by the New South Wales government that have increased the numbers of people in custody. And the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody over 3 decades ago found that First Nations people do not die at a higher rate in custody. What happens is that First Nations people come into custody at a higher rate, and that is entirely preventable.
What do you mean it's entirely preventable? Tell us about that.
The government could, rather than taking a law and order approach to addressing the issues that lead to people coming into custody at a higher rate, the government could not introduce these laws, roll back laws that have increased and disproportionately targeted First Nations people. And the government could address the risk factors for criminalisation, for people coming into the criminal justice system through early intervention, through evidence-led approaches that aren't just law and order approaches that criminalise First Nations people.
Camilla, you mentioned before there was a Royal Commission into Deaths in Custody 30 years ago. A number of those key recommendations have still not been adopted. So is it fair to say this is a failure of federal and state governments on both sides of politics for decades?
This is a failure, and the government knows what it has to do. It really does. Numerous First Nations organisations, academics, other community organisations, other criminal justice experts have told the government time and time again in inquiries, in reviews, in royal commissions what needs to be done, and yet they have not listened.
Why don't you think both governments and both levels of government, state and federal, Liberal, Labor, have not done this? Like, why haven't they?
It's a complicated question, isn't it? I guess that question is for the government themselves. It's baffling to me that you could have experts, people working in this system, people who see these issues every day, say time and time again, this is what needs to happen. Don't introduce these laws. These laws are going to lead to little children going into custody, to higher numbers of young children going into custody. And to ignore that expert evidence is baffling to me. And as the coroner has said, also distressing.
In regards to the coroner there, the Magistrate O'Sullivan referred to figures from the New South Wales Bureau of Crime Stats and Research that showed the number of Aboriginal people in custody had risen by 18.9% just over the past 5 years. So you can say with those stats, Camilla, not only are the authorities not addressing this issue, but it's actually getting worse.
Yeah, and that's horrifying. In 2025, that's horrifying. That's horrifying when the New South Wales government has committed to closing the gap, when the federal government has committed to closing the gap. There's strategies in place to say this is what you should do, and yet that is not happening.
So in regards to, and we know it's a very, very complicated scenario, it's complicated answers, but we know now there's another inquiry that's set to be handed down next year, the findings. How frustrating do you find this when you're on the front line there every day? These aren't stats. These are people. There are families, there are loved ones that die or they lose their loved ones. How do we turn this around, and how frustrating do you find it that we're still talking about inquiries and recommendations and no action?
Yeah, it's so frustrating. We don't need another review. We really don't need another review. The government knows what it needs to do. They need to bring in urgent legislative reform and systemic reform at every stage of the criminal justice process. They need to address the disproportionate targeting of First Nations people by New South Wales Police. It's incredibly frustrating, and obviously for First Nations, families, communities, organisations and people, it's even more frustrating to tell the government time and time again, this is what needs to be done. You need to listen to us, and to just have those calls, that evidence, all the work that goes into every time responding to these reviews, to these commissions, to these inquiries, and to have all that work ignored. It's very frustrating.
Do you think this is a national shame, what we're seeing in 2025?
It's absolutely a national shame to know what needs to happen and to have numbers of First Nations people in the criminal justice system, in custody, in jail, First Nations children, to have that rising in 2025, that is a national shame. And the Boxar figures that came out recently were absolutely appalling. And laws have been introduced in New South Wales that the government has said they know will increase numbers of children in custody. So it's appalling and horrifying. And yes, it is a national shame.
Camilla, I'm glad you mentioned there about First Nations children, because we know of many stories that we're seeing 10-year-old children that have allegedly committed a crime that are being locked up in jail. Many first thoughts that we have are, what is happening to that child at the age of 10 if they're allegedly committing these crimes and then being locked up in jail? That doesn't help that 10-year-old. That doesn't help deal with the problems to start with. How do you think we should look at this differently?
No. Putting a 10-year-old in jail will not make the community safer, in the same way that putting an adult into jail will not make the community safer. It doesn't address the causes of recidivism. It doesn't address the causes of being at risk of entering the criminal justice system. And I would ask, where are the resources being put? Are the resources being put into communities, into families, into schools? Are they being put in where they should be? Or are the resources just being put into more police, more jails? And what is it that is going to make our community safer and a community and laws that we all feel, positive and good about? And I would say it's very unlikely, right, that the resources are being put where they should be put.
So if you had any decision makers listening to you right now, what would you say to them about where we are in 2025?
I would say to them, you need to listen to Aboriginal controlled community organisations. You need to listen to First Nations leaders and First Nations communities, and you need to do and implement what they have been calling for over 3 decades, and not just put in place more laws that are going to criminalise people, that are going to lead to more people in custody. You need to look at these figures, at this data, at the repercussions of what's happening, and you need to implement immediate and urgent legislative and systemic change.
We really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you so much, Camilla.
Thank you so much.
That was CEO of the Redfern Legal Centre, Camilla Pandolfini. And that's it for this episode of the afternoon edition of The Briefing. We'd love you to subscribe or follow us on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. And we'll be back in your feed tomorrow morning. I'm Natarsha Belling. Thanks for your company.